The low hum of the air conditioner in the hospital waiting room couldn't mask the distinctive smell of disinfectant and anxiety that permeated the air. It was a Monday morning, the kind where time seemed to drag intentionally, and the fluorescent lights cast a sickly pallor on everything, making people feel even more vulnerable than they already were. In the corner to the right, near the window overlooking the parking lot, a woman of about 60 sat waiting. Her hands, bearing the dark spots time had gently deposited on her skin, rested on a worn brown vinyl purse. Her gray hair was neatly combed, held back by a simple barrette that had seen better days. She wore a simple floral dress, the kind you find in department stores, yet she carried herself with a natural dignity no designer label could surpass. Helen watched the activity around her silently, her deep brown eyes, which had witnessed decades of joys and sorrows, absorbed every detail with the patience of someone who had learned that life is made up more of waiting than of rushing. Next to her, a young mother tried to soothe a crying baby while frantically typing on her phone. Further on, a man in a suit read the newspaper with a serious expression, occasionally checking his watch with visible impatience. What no one in the room knew was that Helen had arrived at 5 in the morning. Not because her appointment was so early, but because she had to take 3 different buses to get to the hospital, and her minimum wage retirement didn't allow for luxuries like taxis or ride-sharing apps. She had woken at 3 in the morning, made a simple breakfast of stale bread and coffee, and left her house in the dark, carrying with her the hope that the tests would finally provide answers to the pain that had been dwelling in her chest for months. When the receptionist, a young woman with platinum blonde hair and perfectly manicured nails, called her name for the first time, Helen stood up promptly. Her movements were slow, not because of her age, but out of the carefulness of someone who knows that every gesture must be measured to avoid causing more pain than already exists. She approached the counter with a shy smile, the kind of smile humble people offer when they don't want to be a bother. "Mrs. Helen Santos," the receptionist asked without looking up from her computer screen. "Yes, that's me," Helen replied, her soft voice carrying a slight country accent that betrayed her simple origins. "Do you have insurance?" The question was accompanied by a quick glance that scanned Helen from head to toe in an almost imperceptible instant assessment. "No, it's through the public health system. I have all the paperwork here." Helen began to open her purse, carefully removing a yellowed envelope containing her medical documents with the care of someone who knows they represent her only chance for treatment. The receptionist sighed discreetly, a sound that didn't go unnoticed by Helen, though she chose to ignore it. "The doctor is seeing insured patients first. You can wait." There was no deliberate cruelty in the young woman's voice, just an indifference that had become routine. Helen nodded understandingly and returned to her seat, rearranging the papers in her purse with the same precision with which she had stored them. She sat down again, adjusting her dress and folding her hands in her lap, assuming the posture of someone used to waiting. An hour passed. Then, too, Helen watched people arrive, be called and leave, while she remained there, patient as a tree waiting for rain. Her stomach rumbled softly. She had skipped breakfast to avoid being late, but she took small sips of water from a bottle she had brought from home, making each sip last as long as possible. During the wait, her eyes met those of other people in the room a few times. An older gentleman in a button-down shirt, who had arrived after her but had already been seen, gave her a silent nod of acknowledgement as he passed by on his way out. A nurse passing by the reception noticed her constant presence, and Helen perceived a flicker of what might have been compassion in her eyes, but nothing was said. It was almost noon when the situation became more apparent. A young executive, dressed in an impeccable suit and carrying a genuine leather briefcase, rushed to the counter. Without waiting in the line that had formed, he went directly to the receptionist. "I need to be seen urgently. I have an important meeting at 2, he declared, extending a gold insurance card. The receptionist, who minutes earlier had informed Helen that there were no more appointments available that morning, suddenly found an opening in the schedule. "Of course, sir. The doctor can see you right away." Helen watched the scene without judgment, but with the quiet wisdom of someone who understands the invisible hierarchies that govern the world. There was no bitterness in her gaze, only a melancholic acceptance that spoke of decades of similar experiences. She continued to wait, because she knew that protesting wouldn't change her position in life's queue. It would only make her lose the composure she so diligently tried to maintain. That's when something unexpected happened. In the waiting room, his eyes met Helen's. Something in that exchange made him pause. Perhaps it was the resigned patience in her eyes, or the dignity with which she maintained her posture despite the hours of waiting. Dr. Henry Moore had seen thousands of patients throughout his career, but he had developed a special sensitivity for recognizing those who suffered in silence. He approached the counter and in a low but audible voice for anyone paying attention, asked the receptionist, "How long has that woman been waiting?" "Oh, the public health system patient, since early this morning, doctor. But we still have the private insurance patients to see." Dr. Henry gently interrupted, "Please call her now." There was a momentary hesitation. The receptionist looked around the room, noticing other private insurance patients waiting. "But doctor, Mr. Cardoso just arrived and Mrs. Helen Santos." Dr. Henry called personally, addressing her with a smile that carried decades of medical compassion. "Could you please come with me?" Helen slowly rose, surprised but not daring to question. She carefully picked up her purse and followed the doctor, her footsteps echoing softly on the cold hospital floor. As she passed the reception desk, she could feel the curious and even disapproving glances of other patients, but Dr. Henry maintained a posture that did not allow for questioning. Even before they entered the examination room, and this is where our story takes on a dimension beyond what we can imagine, Dr. Henry did something that would transform not only that moment, but Helen's entire perception of her own dignity. He held the door open for her, not as an automatic courtesy, but with the genuine respect offered to someone whose worth we deeply recognize. "You know," he said, as he adjusted the chair for her to sit comfortably, "my mother used to tell me that a person's patience reveals the greatness of their character. Rarely have I seen someone wait with such serenity." Helen felt something stir in her chest, an emotion that hadn't visited her heart in a long time. It wasn't just gratitude, but recognition. For the first time in a long time, someone had seen her not as a public health system case, not as a number in line, but as a human being worthy of consideration. And you who are following this story probably feel the same thing Helen felt at that moment, this deep need to believe that there are still people who see beyond appearances, who value human essence above circumstances. If this narrative is touching your heart the same way it touched mine when I experienced it, consider subscribing to our channel and turning on the notification bell, because here you will find, weekly, real stories like this, which remind us that humanity still pulsates strongly amidst the chaos of the modern world. Each new subscription motivates us to continue seeking and sharing these moments of light that restore our faith in people. And now, let's continue with the unfolding of this story, which still holds surprises that will deeply move you. During the consultation, Dr. Henry not only examined Helen with the medical attention she deserved, but he listened. He really listened. Every symptom description, every concern, every fear was received with the seriousness of someone who understands that, for that woman, that consultation represented much more than a medical appointment. It was a chance to be seen, heard, valued. "You know, Dr. Helen," he said, deliberately using the respectful title, "because for me, anyone who has raised children, cared for a family, and contributed to society deserves to be treated as a doctor of life. Your tests show something we need to monitor, but nothing we can't face together. I want you to know that you will always be welcome here, regardless of time or insurance." He carefully wrote the prescriptions, explaining each medication, each procedure, each next step with the patience of someone who understands that medical information is not a privilege, but a right. When he finished, he did something that surprised even Helen. He stood up and walked her to the reception desk. "Schedule Mrs. Helen's follow-up appointments with priority," he instructed the receptionist, his voice carrying a gentle but unquestionable authority, "and make sure she is always well received." The receptionist nodded, and Helen could perceive a subtle change in her posture. It wasn't fear of medical authority, but something deeper, perhaps the recognition that she had witnessed something rare, an act of pure humanity. As Helen headed for the exit, other patients in the waiting room watched her curiously, some still with the same disguised disdain as before, but others with something different in their eyes. An elderly gentleman, who had also been waiting for hours, smiled at her in complicity. A young mother made a subtle gesture of approval. It was as if Dr. Henry's action had created invisible waves of consciousness that spread through the room. But the real transformation happened when Helen was almost at the exit. Henry caught up with her again, carrying a small piece of paper in his hands. "I almost forgot," he said, extending the paper to her. "Here's my personal phone number. If you feel any discomfort or have any questions about the treatment, don't hesitate to call. Medicine only makes sense when we serve those who need it most." Helen held the paper with slightly trembling hands. She couldn't form words immediately. Emotion had taken over her throat. When she finally spoke, her voice came out in a whisper full of gratitude. "Doctor, you can't imagine what this means to me." "I can imagine, Mrs. Helen, and that's exactly why I do it." She left the hospital walking differently, not only because she was taking with her medical answers and a treatment plan, but because she was carrying something much more valuable, the restoration of her dignity. For years, Helen had become accustomed to being invisible, to accepting scraps of attention as if they were favors. That day, she discovered that she deserved much more. The walk to the bus stop seemed lighter, despite the strong afternoon sun. Helen observed the people around her with renewed eyes. She smiled at a child playing on the sidewalk, greeted a street vendor she'd always seen but never really noticed. It was as if the kindness she'd received had awakened a dormant gentleness within her, now yearning to be shared. On the bus ride home, seated near the window, Helen reflected on what had happened. It wasn't just about medical care or priority lines. It was about recognition, about seeing the other as an equal, about understanding that dignity isn't something you earn, it's something you're born with, and some people have the gift of helping us remember that when we forget. She thought about Dr. Henry and wondered what motivated him to act that way. Maybe he too had been invisible at some point in his life. Maybe he had a mother like her, who taught by example that kindness is the universal language of humanity. Or maybe he was simply someone who had understood that true power doesn't lie in placing yourself above others, but in using your position to uplift them. When she arrived home, a small two-room house in a simple neighborhood on the outskirts of town, Helen sat in her favorite chair on the porch. It was a white plastic chair, already yellowed with age, but it had become her refuge for contemplating the afternoons. That afternoon, however, her contemplation had a different flavor. She thought back on all the times she had felt diminished, all the condescending looks she had received, all the times her financial situation had determined the quality of treatment she received. Not with bitterness, but with the wisdom of someone who finally understands that these moments say more about those who offer them than about those who receive them. At the same time, she remembered every act of kindness she had witnessed throughout her life. The neighbor who shared sugar when hers ran out, the bus driver who always waited for her when he saw her running to catch the bus, the baker who occasionally added an extra roll to her purchase without charging her, and now, Dr. Henry, who had seen in her not a beneficiary of the public health system, but a human being deserving of care and respect. That night, Helen did something she hadn't done in a long time. She called her sister, who lived in another city. She told her about the day, about the doctor, about how valued she felt. Her voice carried a joy that hadn't visited her vocal cords in a long time. "You know, Mary," she said, "today I remembered who I am." On the other end of the line, her sister smiled. She could hear the difference in her tone of voice. She could feel that something had changed. "And who are you, Helen?" "I'm a woman who raised 3 children, working as a domestic worker, who cared for her mother until her last days, who never broke her word, who always helped those in need. I am someone who deserves to be treated with dignity, not as a favor, but as a right." From that day on, Helen began to walk differently through the world, not with arrogance or pretension, but with the quiet awareness of her own worth. She remained kind, she remained humble, but now she carried with her a self-respect that was reflected in every interaction. More importantly, she began to replicate what she had received. When she saw someone being treated with disdain or indifference, she offered a smile of encouragement. When she witnessed injustice, she no longer remained silent, but spoke with the serenity of someone who knows her own worth and therefore recognizes the worth of others. Weeks later, when she returned to the hospital for her first follow-up, the receptionist greeted her by name, without her having to introduce herself. Dr. Henry received her with the same warmth as the first consultation, and Helen could tell that her attitude had influenced other hospital staff. There was a different atmosphere, more human, more respectful. During that second appointment, Dr. Henry commented, "You know, your serenity that first day deeply affected me. It reminded me why I chose to be a doctor." Helen smiled. "And you reminded me why it's worth believing in people." It was a silent exchange of recognition, two human beings who had met at the right moment, each offering the other exactly what they needed to receive. Dr. Henry had found in Helen the reminder that medicine is above all about humanity. Helen had found in him the confirmation that dignity is non-negotiable. Months passed, and the story of Helen and Dr. Henry began to echo through the hospital corridors in subtle ways, not through direct comments or grand proclamations, but through small changes in the atmosphere of the place. Other doctors began to pay more attention to patients who had been waiting longer. Staff members began to treat everyone with greater kindness. It was as if that initial gesture had planted seeds of humanity that were now sprouting into everyday actions. Helen, in turn, became a kind of silent ambassador of dignity in her neighborhood, not by preaching or giving speeches, but simply by living according to what she had learned about her own worth. Neighbors began to seek her out for advice. Young people came to ask for guidance, and she received everyone with the same serene patience she had shown that morning at the hospital. One day, while waiting for the bus, Helen witnessed a scene that made her remember her own experience deeply. An elderly woman, visibly of humble origins, was being treated roughly by a store employee where she had tried to make a purchase. The man spoke loudly, gestured impatiently, clearly irritated by having to deal with someone who couldn't quickly understand the payment procedures. Helen discreetly approached, and with the same serenity she had learned to value in herself, addressed the employee. "Excuse me, may I help you with your purchase?" There was no confrontation in her voice, no judgment, just a kind offer of help. The employee, perhaps surprised by the respectful intervention, softened their tone and allowed Helen to assist the elderly woman in completing her transaction. When they left the store, the elderly woman thanked her with tears in her eyes. "Thank you, dear. I was feeling so small." "You are never small," Helen replied, gently holding her hands. "Sometimes people forget to see, but that doesn't diminish who we are." It was the wisdom she had learned multiplying, spreading, creating an invisible network of restored dignity. The most beautiful part of this story isn't just Dr. Henry's gesture, although he was the catalyst for the whole transformation. The most beautiful part is the understanding that dignity is like a flame that can be temporarily smothered, but never completely extinguished. When someone has the sensitivity to gently blow on that flame, it burns again with its original force. Helen continued her simple life, but now she carried with her the certainty that she mattered, that her presence in the world made a difference, that her story had value, and that certainty radiated from her almost imperceptibly, but constantly, touching the lives of other people who, like her, had momentarily forgotten their own worth. Dr. Henry continued to practice medicine with the technical excellence he had always demonstrated, but now with an expanded dimension of humanity. Each patient who entered his office was not just a medical case, but a human story deserving of all his attention and respect. And so, That seemingly ordinary morning at the hospital transformed into something much greater than a simple medical appointment. It became a lesson about the transformative power of mutual recognition, about how an act of humanity can restore not only the dignity of the recipient, but also the humanity of the giver. Helen's story teaches us that heroism doesn't need uniforms, doesn't need grand spectacular gestures, doesn't need public recognition. Sometimes, the greatest heroic act is simply to see the other truly see, and treat them with the dignity that every human being deserves simply for existing. In a world that often teaches us to value people for what they have, for the position they hold, for the usefulness they represent, the story of Helen and Dr. Henry reminds us of a fundamental truth. Every person carries within them an inherent dignity that doesn't depend on external circumstances to exist, but that sometimes only needs someone to acknowledge it to shine again in all its splendor. And perhaps that is the most beautiful lesson of this story, that we all have the power to be that someone for another person, just as we all deserve to find that someone on our path when we most need to be reminded of who we truly are behind the circumstances that temporarily define us.